Hey there everyone, today I'll be going over the basics of Vena mappings. Specifically, we're going to be putting together a balance sheet report. We're going to be pulling in values. We're going to go over how to troubleshoot a report, some basic things to keep in mind as you build out reports, some best practices, and just some things that need to happen in order for data to actually to be pulled into a report. Okay. So the first thing I always do when I go to build a report is I always create a separate tab that just lists out the dimensions I have in the data model. And if you don't know where to find the dimensions, you can find them in the data model, just listed out at the top here. So in my case, it's account, entity, period, year, so forth and so forth. Okay. And now this kind of allows us to start to build out a sort of home where all of our mappings are going to live, and where someone who had no part in creating the report can come in and see how the report was configured really easily. Okay. So once I have that laid out, the next thing I ask myself is, okay, how do I want to see each of these dimensions inside of my report? Because one of the keys to actually be able to pull in data from Vena into Excel here is that each dimension needs to have some sort of mapping associated with it. For example, if we were building a report and we put a mapping for each of these dimensions up here, but we didn't include currency, well, then our report wouldn't pull in any data. So that's kind of why you go about building out this list, so you can keep track of each dimension that you've mapped and how you've gone about mapping it. Okay. So the first questions we're going to be asking ourselves here is how we want to see each of these dimensions, because the mapping options that we have in Vena are page, row, and column. Okay. So page mappings are used for dimensions that are going to be consistent among or the same across the entire report. So a good example might be a scenario, right? Where for the report you're building, you might only need actuals to be pulling into that report, which in that case, you could put on the page, easy peasy. Maybe you'll only be looking at USD and for the currency, so that could also go on the page. Maybe you're only looking at 2022 data, so you could put it on the page, easy peasy. Now, one thing you may be thinking about, because maybe you've seen some vendor reports before, is this choose box, where you can kind of use that in conjunction with the page mappings to set something to be true for the whole report, but have the functionality to choose that at any time you want. So for instance, if you wanted to have the report for only one entity, but have the ability to choose which entity that is, you would do it through this functionality. But we won't get into that this video here. We'll go into that kind of later on in the future, okay? So page mappings, stuff that's going to be the same across the whole report. And then we have our rows and our columns, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. You would put dimensions that you want to see on the rows. You would assign a row mapping to them, and dimensions that you want to see across the columns, you would put a column mapping to those. Okay, so let's go over how you would go about doing that. So for account, I'm going to go over to my report in the other tab, and I notice that, you know what? I want to put account on the rows here, okay? Because I see it coming down. So we're going to say we're going to put on the row. Okay, so we're just going to note this here. We're going to say dimensions, mapping, or position, and then we're going to have a mapping column here. Okay, this is pretty standard across many reports you'll see inside. I just have this sort of like home base. Okay, these three kind of columns. Keep in mind, these two columns will be purely context, in that you could completely delete these two columns and leave this mapping column that we'll be putting together later on, and the report will still work fine. But just kind of best practice to have these two columns here, okay? So we're going to put our account on the row. Our entity, we're going to just say we're going to put it on the page because we want it to be the same for all. It's going to be the same for the whole report. Period, we're going to run this for just one period, so we could put that on the page as well. Now, year, we're going to put it on the page as well, because it's only be 1 year. Scenario can be the page as well, because it's going to be consistent throughout the whole thing. Now, we're getting down to our last two dimensions here, and we have measure and currency, which could also be on the page in a way. But a really important thing to note is that in order to bring back data, you need to have at least one row mapping and one column mapping. Okay, so we got to put something on a column there to actually bring in that data. So in this case, I'll just say I'll put the measure on the column, and I'll put currency on the page here. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to map all my pages first. Okay, so I'm going to come here. I'm going to say, okay, entity, that's a page mapping. Cool. I'm going to go into column D. I'm going to click page, and then we are introduced into this page mapping interface here. Okay, it's going to be this very similar for row and column. So let's just kind of quickly go over the different things we see here. Okay, very at the top we see our data model. So shouldn't really change much. Should be just exactly what you have. Then we have our account. Okay, so we're gonna want to change this drop down here to the dimension we're trying to map. So in our case right now, we're mapping entity. As you can see, column D, that's the one we're kind of focusing on right now. So we're gonna change that to entity. Now the section. Okay, the section here is how we associate all of the page mappings. Okay, so we'll have multiple page mappings as you see on like right below this cell here. We're gonna have a couple more. So we need to group those together to tell Vena that that these are all related, that we're relating these together basically. I don't know if there's a better way to put that, but you'll see the more you go about building reports, you'll get more familiar with these things here, okay? So for the purpose of this, I'll just call it S1 for section 1, okay? And now I'm gonna say which entity I wanna bring over, which I'll just say the rollup, I want all entities in my report. Okay, now you'll see we have a fancy, ugly named range being pulled in here. That just indicates that it has a Vena mapping. Now, if you've messed up and you want to undo the mapping, all you need to do is head over to the clear mapping button here. Do that, boom, it removes your page mapping. Also, if you want to be fancy and do a shortcut, if you type in, for example, all entities, like that, and it's an existing rollup within your hierarchy, Vena will automatically look it up and say, okay, all entities, that lives in the entity dimension, and we're going to automatically bring it over here. And I don't think I mentioned it, but to bring stuff over, you can click it, and you can do this right button here, or you can just double click it, double click stuff anywhere you want. Okay. I'm going to say all entities. I'll say okay. My period, I will go the drop down, click period, all periods, and I'm just going to say period 1. That's all I want to see for just January. Still S1, if you'll notice. Year, I'm gonna go to the drop down, year, and I am gonna say 2021. Scenario, page again, come down here, scenario, and I'm gonna say actuals. Okay, and then currency, notice I skipped over measure because we're gonna be putting that in the column. I'm gonna go to currency here, and I'm just gonna go to local currency because that's where all our data is currently living. Okay, so now we just have two things left to map to actually be able to pull in data. We need to map out our row here, and we need to map out our column. Okay, so I'm gonna head back over to our balance sheet here, and I'm gonna begin to map out these rows. Okay, so if you take a look at 1000 here, and this has the full alias and so forth. There's, you likely won't have this kind of perfect template maybe ready for you to just map. So you could do it a couple ways. Let's say we didn't have 1000 here, but we knew we wanted to count 1000. Well, we can put in 1000. We can come up here, we could click row, just like we did for page, except you see it's a very similar view here. Just like for page though, we need to select the dimension that we want to map. And now we want to select that section that we did before with all the pages. Because we want to say that this row that we're about to map, we want to relate it to all the previous page mappings that we just did a second ago, okay? But you'll see that there's another one here, the block. Okay, so oftentimes the naming convention isn't super important here. You can call it what you want. I'm going to call it B1, but what the block indicates is just an intersection between the rows and the columns. Okay, so I know that's not going to make much sense here. I'll try and make a little visualization. But for instance, you might want to have 1000 right here, account 1000 associated with a column here, but you might want account 1000 down here again for a different purpose. But to do that, you would need to have another column with a different block, right? Because really the way that Vena works is that when I map this 1000 to a row, Vena is going to look through the whole entirety of row 11 to find a corresponding column mapping, okay, wherever it might be. Okay, so we're going to map right now our column. So we're going to come out here. It's going to be columns, and it's going to be our measure that we're still missing. All measures, and it lives in that value. Okay, notice we're doing same section, same block as before. Okay, I'm going to hit OK, bring that in. And now this row here, the rest of our report isn't mapped yet, but this specific row here is mapped because if you'll notice, all of our pages, all of our dimensions are accounted for, right? We have our pages over here, and now all we have in the other section is our measure and our account, which if you look here, if we span out row 11, if we span out column D, which column D is our mapping, you'll notice that there's an intersection here, right? And this intersection between the column and the row is where that value is going to be pulled in. Okay, so if we had this mapping here, and we can cut and paste the mapping anywhere we want, if we put it here, well, all of a sudden our 1000 and our column, our 1000 and our column, now they intersect here. So that's where our value is going to be brought in. Okay, so just to show this, and we'll see if value is going to be brought in. Test. No value? Wait, no value. 1 second. Maybe let me adjust to all periods maybe. Let's see. 1 second. All periods. Still no value? Okay, maybe I'm in the wrong year. Let's try 2020. You're making me look bad. Okay, boom. Sorry, we were in the wrong year. Okay, so you can see we've brought back a value, actually, okay? But before we go, actually, we're just gonna map out the rest of this report here, okay? So you don't need to go by one for these rows. Actually, what we can do now is we could say, for all this section here, I'm gonna click row, and if you'll notice on the green side here, we have 17 out of 17 cells mapped, which means that Vena found a matching pair for each of these rows that aren't blank. Okay, but you'll notice if I change something here, if I change this to hello, this will cause an error. Okay, and now if I go about doing the same thing I just did to map in bulk, well, it will mess up because 1030, see, it still says 1717, but it defaulted to balance sheet for some reason. Okay, so just keep in mind, keep an eye out on these things because Vena might default to something that you don't want per se, okay? So I'm just gonna reverse that right there, select everything again, boom, refresh, and now we're pulling in a bunch of values from Vena, okay? We have our total assets right down here, the roll-up of it. You could do formulas, because note that this total this total assets right now is actually a roll-up from Vena, right? You'll see it's pulling in this value here, which pulls in everything below it in the hierarchy, right? But you also could, if you wanted to, you don't need to map this. If you want to just make it a formula and say, you know, equals this, plus this, boom, same number, right? You can do it that way too. It's entirely up to you. But let's imagine now that actually, let's just put together the rest of the report here, okay? So I'm going to select all the rest of these, all the way down to total liabilities, row, boom, 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 S1 and B1, those are our associations that we need. I'll refresh, and boom, we have our balance sheet. It's balanced, has all the accounts we need, all the data we want, right? But now imagine that we messed something up in the process, because let's be honest, it won't oftentimes be this easy to actually map out a report, okay? So let's just say, for instance, that we forgot to map the scenario to our report, right? So it's gone. Now what would happen? Well, if we refresh, you'll notice that we have an unmapped dimension, but this was a bad example because scenario is actually going to be defaulted to all in this case. So you still, I mean, let's see actually. Will it bring in the numbers? I don't think it should, unless it's defaulted. Okay, so it is being defaulted to all. But let's unmap one more thing, so it for sure won't. Is local currency have a default? Let's see. No, it's not. Okay. So if you unmap local currency, we have that unmap. Now, no values are being pulled in, right? And if you come over here to our errors and warnings log, it's going to tell us exactly why, right? If you didn't get this popped up, you can just click Analyze Template, boop, 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 hit OK, and you can see that right there. So we see Sheet 1, Section B1, Block B1, Scenario is mapped to all because it's defaulted, and currency is mapped to default member, right? Because if you don't have a mapping assigned to something inside of Vena, it's just gonna, there's a member inside of Vena, like if you look at currency here, where it has that pin, and if there's no mapping in the report for that dimension, it's just gonna default the report to look at that right there. Okay, so that's why you gotta make sure that everything's mapped out. So I'm just gonna go back, local currency, and it was actual, okay, and I'm just gonna bulk map this, perfect, S1 currency, there we go. And now if I refresh again, boom, we have all of our values, except for our, I can remap total assets, there we go, boom, and now we have everything mapped out, okay? And now once you're done with your report, you can click Save Template, and that's going to save your template back to Vena. So I know this seems like a basic kind of mapping thing, but I think the main takeaways to take from this are that every dimension needs to be mapped for a report to bring in the values you want. And then just it's really important to note the distinction between the page, the rows, and the columns. It might seem like a lot for now, but I think in the future, in the coming videos maybe too, it should make a lot more sense soon, okay? So I appreciate you all watching, and see you again soon.